Hello, everyone, and welcome to this time of worship and Bible study sponsored by the First Baptist Church of Baldwin Park, California. This is the first Sunday with the time change, and probably the first Sunday for many folks in many years that we haven't had to worry about losing an hour of sleep. All the days seem to be running together, at least those of us who are in areas where there's still a COVID shutdown. We've been going through the third chapter of Ephesians, phrase by phrase, verse by verse, and today we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. So why don't we go ahead and read that passage. To give context again, we'll go back to the beginning of verse 14, which is where this passage begins. This is a prayer from the Apostle Paul, and we're going really slowly through it, but just to remind us of what Paul is praying for, let's read verses 14 through the middle of verse 19 in Ephesians chapter 3. Paul writes, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge." When I was in college and seminary, like most young students preparing for the ministry, I studied the languages of the Bible, Hebrew and Greek. And they're both difficult languages for English speakers. Hebrew seemed particularly foreign to me, and I think probably to most students. The letters look nothing at all like English letters. And it's an Oriental language, so the structure and syntax and all of that is very different. You read Hebrew from right to left instead of left to right. And so that means, among other things, that the back of the book for us is the beginning of the book for them. So it's a very foreign looking language in many aspects. Now, my first professor of Hebrew was in college at William Carey University. His name was Dr. William Clausen. Whenever we students would complain about how difficult Hebrew was, he would always say to us, "It's just like math." It took me a long time to figure out what he meant by that, because I would look at the Hebrew Bible and think that doesn't look anything at all like math. But I came to realize that what he was saying was that, like math, learning Hebrew is done in steps. It's step by step, layer by layer. You take what you learned here, and then you move on to the next thing, and the next thing builds upon the foundation of what you've already learned. And so in that regard, he was right. Now, the same could be said about this passage that we're reading, Hebrews chapter 3, as we're going through it, really phrase by phrase. Each step or each layer builds upon the last in terms of forming our theology here about what Paul is talking about. We know from earlier in the chapter that as Christians we are all part of the church, and as the church we are part of God's eternal purpose in the world. As such, God gives us his power and his strength to enable us to do the things he calls us to do and to live life victoriously. Through the power of his Spirit, he roots us and grounds us in love so that we can withstand the storms of life. And all of that leads to what he shares with us today in our verses 18 and the first part of verse 19. Paul wants us to know and to experience the greatness of God's love. When our daughter Lisa was little, about 4 years old, now Lisa's a mom now, she's grown, she's got 2 children of her own. But when she was just a little thing, about 4 or 5, she would come up to me sometimes and she'd stretch out her arms as wide as she could, and she would say, "Dad, I love you this much." And she'd stretch out her arms like that. I was thinking about that as I was reading this passage again on the greatness of God's love. And Paul is asking us that question. Do you understand how great God's love is? It's pretty clear from reading the passage that Paul assumes the Christians in Ephesus don't fully grasp the greatness of God's love. And I would say if they didn't fully grasp it, we probably don't either. And so that's why Paul prays in this passage that they and us would comprehend the greatness of God's love. And to help us to do that, Paul speaks of the greatness of God's love in 4 dimensions: wide, deep, high, and long. Let's look a little more closely at what Paul says. He speaks of the breadth of God's love. That means God's love is wide. It's broad, it's inclusive. I saw a man on TV once, it was on one of the reality shows, I think it might have been Pawn Stars. Anyway, they had a coin, an ancient rare coin come into the shop, and they wanted an expert to look at it, to determine its value. And so he came in and he looked at the coin. This guy knows everything there is to know about ancient coins from before the time of Christ. This guy looked at this coin that nobody in the pawn shop knew anything about, and he looked at it and he immediately knew everything there was to know about it. Now, he might not know much about other subjects, but on that one particular subject, he knows everything there is to know. Now, with some people, love is like that. They have great love for some people, their family, their friends, people who are nice to them, and so on. And they have absolutely no love for other people. One of the things that shocked me reading, I love to read about World War II and all of that, that history. One of the things that shocked me in reading about the Nazis, you read about these people and you assume that, they were just filled with hate for everybody in the world. I mean, they'd have to be, right, to do what they did. One of the things that shocked me in reading about them, these Nazis who sent, millions of people to the gas chambers and all of the horrible things that they did. A lot of them, they loved animals, they loved their family, they played with their children. They had love for certain people, but were filled with hatred for others. Paul is telling us here that God's love is wide. It's inclusive. It's wide enough to include everyone. I like to think about the life of Jesus because Jesus is always the reflection of what God is and what God is like. Paul tells us that in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. What was Jesus like? Look at the people that Jesus loved, the outcasts, the sinners, the downtrodden, the forgotten, the people who were, cast off by others. Jesus loved those people. His love was inclusive. It included everyone. We read in John 3:16, I guess the best known verse in all the Bible, certainly for Christians. Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Now, we understand that when Jesus uses the word world, that he's talking about people, right? But interestingly, the word that Jesus uses there is not the ordinary Greek word for people. The ordinary Greek word for people is a word that is always used in the context of people groups, families, nations, religions, and so on. And I think Jesus, understanding human nature as he did, understood our tendency to want to group ourselves into those who are in the group and those who are out of the group. We love the people who are like us and we reject the people who aren't. So when Jesus said, "For God so loved the world," he doesn't use the normal Greek word for people. Instead, he uses the Greek word cosmos. We have that word in English too, but it's actually a Greek word. And in Greek, it means all of creation. Jesus wants to make sure that we understand that when he said, "For God so loved the world," he's not talking about just some people or some groups. He's talking about everyone. God's love is wide enough to include everyone. I want to point out something that's interesting about God's love being broad and wide and inclusive. His love is wide enough to include everyone, but it's also very specific. The miracle of the gospel isn't just that God loves everybody, but that God loves me and that God loves you. He doesn't just love groups of people, he loves the individuals. That's the true miracle of the gospel. Paul said it like this. He wrote in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, God showed his love to us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. God's love is wide enough to include everyone and specific enough to love each and every one of us individually. And then Paul speaks of the length of God's love. He's saying that you could explore the length of God for all eternity, the love of God for all eternity, and never find the end of it. Years ago, I saw a guy on YouTube. It was from a church service, and he was giving his testimony. And I think he had this verse in mind when he said, whenever people ask me, what are we going to do in heaven? I always say to them, we're going to be explorers. Now, that's an odd thing to say. I've never heard anybody say that before, but he went on to explain. He said, when we get there, we're going to set out walking to see if we can find the end or the limit of God's love. And he said, we're going to walk for 10,000 years and never find the end of it. And we'll see somebody coming in the other direction, coming back from where we're going. And we'll say to them, did you ever find the end of God's love? Did you ever find the limit? And they'll say, nope. And I met somebody coming back who'd been walking for 1,000,000 years in that direction. And they said they'd never found the end of it either. That's what Paul is saying here, that there is no limit to God's love. Now, if you truly want to understand the love of God, you have to come to the cross, right? That's where we see it. You remember years ago, the Hallmark greeting company, they had an advertising campaign. It may still have it, I don't know. They would show someone giving someone else one of their cards, and then the tagline was Hallmark, when you care enough to send the very best. My son William, when he was just a little tyke, he would make his own cards. All of our kids did that, for special days, birthdays and whatnot. They'd make their own cards and draw a picture and write a note and all of that. But William must have seen those commercials, and it must have made an impression on his little heart, Hallmark, when you care enough to send the very best. And so he would write on the back of it Hallmark, and he would say, look, Dad, it's a Hallmark. And then later, as he got older, he changed that to Willmark, and I think he still does that, even though he's in his 30s now. He'll write Willmark on the back of the card, and it's just a reminder of that idea about when you care enough to send the very best. That's what God did through his son Jesus. That's what we see on the cross. Paul wrote in Romans that God spared not his own son, but gave him up for us all. That's the length of God's love. That's the length to which God will go to show us his love. God's love is long enough to go to any limit. And then Paul speaks of the depth of God's love. He's saying that God's love is profound, it's deep. I read a story again about World War II. It was about one of the concentration camps. This was a camp in an area of the camp where women were. One of the women was a mother who had a little baby, and this testimony was given by one of the other women prisoners there who survived. This mother who had this young baby was very weak, and she was lying down on the ground, and she had her little baby with her. The only food that mother had was a sweet potato that someone had managed to find for her. And the mother would take a bite of a piece of the sweet potato, and she'd put it in her mouth. The baby was too small to chew the sweet potato herself. The mother would take that little piece of sweet potato and put it in her mouth, and she'd chew on it until it was soft, and then she'd put it in the baby's mouth so the baby could eat it. The mother was so weak that she didn't know if they were going to survive the night or not, but she kept doing that, chewing up little pieces of sweet potato and putting them into the baby's mouth. The mother died that night, but the baby survived because of what the mother did for her, the depth of the mother's love. Now, we understand something of the love a mother would have for her child, the depth of a mother's love for that beloved infant. But the word that the New Testament uses for God's love is a word that seems to be unknown outside of the New Testament. It's used only to describe the love of God, the love that God has for us. And unlike the love that a mother has for her child, because the child is lovable and beautiful and worthy of the love, the word the New Testament uses for God's love, the word agape in Greek. It's love that takes no thought for the worthiness of the recipient. It's love that doesn't take into account if the object of the love deserves the love or not. Agape is love without conditions. And that's what Paul is saying here, that there is no bottom to God's love, to the depths of his love. God's love is deep enough to love the unlovable. And then lastly, Paul speaks about the height of God's love. You know, my wife is always asking me to reach things for her that she's too short to reach, something in the house or something in the garage. Well, how high can God's love reach? Paul would tell us that God's love is tall enough and high enough to reach all the way into heaven. He can reach deep down into the depths of sin and despair and find the lost sinner, and then take that lost sinner and reach them all the way up into heaven. Some of you may know the name D.L. Moody, Dwight L. Moody. He was a famous preacher in his day. I guess in his day, sort of, the Billy Graham of the world. He was known internationally. He was pastor of a famous church in Chicago, which is still in existence, by the way. Anyway, D.L. Moody was visiting in England, and he heard a young preacher named Henry Morehouse preach. And he was so moved by his sermon that he told Morehouse, if you ever visit the United States and if you're in Chicago, I want you to let me know and I will let you preach in my church. And so the following year, Henry Morehouse was visiting in the States, and he made a special trip to Chicago, and he actually showed up on the doorstep and told Moody, I'm here in Chicago, and you told me if I was ever here, you'd let me preach in your church. And so Moody arranged that, and the following Sunday, it was on a Sunday night, he had Henry Morehouse preach in his church. And Henry Morehouse preached from John 3:16. The pastor, D.L. Moody, was so moved by the sermon that he asked Morehouse if he would come back the next night and preach again. Even though there was no service scheduled, he went ahead and scheduled it and asked Morehouse to come back. And Morehouse came back again the next night, and he preached again from John 3:16. And Moody was so moved by the sermon that Henry Morehouse became known as the man who moved the multitudes. That's what they used to call D.L. Moody, the man who moved the multitudes. And Morehouse became known as the man who moved the multitudes. And Moody invited him to come back again. And he did this every night for a week. And every night for a week, Henry Morehouse preached from John 3:16. When he came to the last night of, I guess by then it was a revival service, When he came to the last night of the revival, he got into the pulpit and he said, I've been trying to tell you every night how much God loves you. And he said, suppose I could borrow Jacob's ladder and could climb that staircase until I at last stood on the streets of gold in the city of God. And suppose I were to seek out Gabriel, the herald angel, and were to say to him, Gabriel, you stand day and night in the presence of God. Tell me, how much does God love the world? And he said, I know exactly what Gabriel would say to me. He would say, Henry Morehouse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. That's how much God loves the world. Now, Paul didn't write John 3:16, but that's the very thing he's trying to tell us here in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 18. He's giving us the very same message about the love of God, love that has no limits. The greatest power on earth is the love of God. God's love can change human history, and it can change the hardest human heart. God's love can reach anywhere, anyone. That's the height of God's love. And Paul wants us to not just know about that love, but he wants us to know that love, to experience it. Because once we know it, it will become the foundation and the cornerstone of our lives. Back in the early 1800s, when Napoleon's army had won one of their great victories, they went into the city that they had captured, and some of his soldiers went into the jail cell that was there in the city. This jail cell had been used perhaps for prisoners of war. When they went into one of the cells underground, really in a dungeon, they found the remains of a prisoner. Now, this prisoner was long since dead. But the leg iron chained around his ankle was still there. This man had obviously been a Christian, because there in his dismal, dank, and dark jail cell, he had scratched a crude cross on the wall. And around the cross, he had written 4 words. Above the cross, he wrote the word height. And below the cross, he wrote the word depth. And to the left, he wrote the word width. And to the right, he wrote the word length. For this soldier of Christ, it was his testimony in his dying moments to the all-surpassing greatness of God's love. That's the love that God has for you and me. Wide enough to include everyone. No one is left out. Deep enough to reach down to lost sinners. Long enough to stretch from eternity to eternity. High enough to lift every one of us into that home in heaven that he has prepared for us. That is the greatness of God's love. Next Sunday, we're going to conclude our study of Ephesians chapter 3 as we look at verses 20 and 21. Paul is going to tell us in those verses that everything that we can think that God can do, everything that we can imagine that God can do, or that we would ever ask him to do, God can do even more than that. So I hope you'll be here with me as we share together in that passage. Until next Sunday, may God bless and keep you.